Hey everybody, welcome to episode number 2 of the Earfuel podcast. So glad to have you along for the ride today. My name is Joel Freemark. Some of you know me as The Daily Guru, and you can find me on Twitter at The Daily Guru, and of course at Get Earfuel. Not much I want to do here at the top. Let's just get into it, shall we? No messing around. You know, there's really only one album I want to talk about this week, and mostly because it's a very long album with a number of famous names on it. It's the self-titled release from the band who are going to call themselves Teenage Time Killers, which it's basically a supergroup. And at the core is Dave Grohl, Nick Oliveri from Queens of the Stone Age, and Slipknot's Corey Taylor. I just realized I didn't qualify Dave Grohl. I'm going to go ahead and assume that in 2015 he has been in the media enough that we all know Dave Grohl by now. Now, there are tons of other guests on this album, and we'll get to those, but those are really the core three, and there really hasn't been a proper supergroup in music since, I don't know, maybe Oysterhead, but that was like 2002. It's been a long time since we've had a legitimate supergroup record an entire album. Don't even try Atoms for Peace on me. Don't even try it. You will lose that argument. Anyway, the first thing that struck me about this album was not the lineup, and it was not the pretty cool name. No, it was the fact that there are 20 songs on this record. 20! And that's without the bonus tracks or, you know, for the unique releases. If you need it, there are 4 more on the deluxe edition in case 20 is somehow not enough for you. That is a very bold move to include so many songs because it leaves a lot of room for things to go wrong. But at the same time, it's for an out-of-the-gates band, because that's really what they are. We know these guys, but this is the first time they've recorded together. That's asking a lot of the listener. You know what? Even for an established band to put 20 songs on an album, that's really, really asking a lot. Now, it's very punk rock in the sense that most of the songs are under 3 minutes and a lot of them are actually under 2. But this also doesn't always work in a band's favor. And depending on the music, I'm sure you've all experienced this, 20 short songs can feel just as long, if not longer, than 10 or 12 slightly longer songs. And that actually eventually becomes the issue here. But you know what? Let's look at the good first, because there is a ton of good going on in this album. There's a lot to enjoy. The first few songs, they're just, they're monsters. There's no other way of saying it. They are monster songs. Heavy doses of punk, metal, hardcore, I mean, even grindcore. If you like things loud and heavy, or loud or heavy, you're going to have your horns in the air for sure. There's a lot to love here. Songs like Crowned by the Light of the Sun, just stunning. It sort of looms over you with this amazing trudge, and it works brilliantly against the song after it that really, it's more in the vein of speed metal, grindcore, definite overtones of Slayer going on in a number of tracks in a good way, really. In a way, the opening 3 songs here are the ideal example of the kind of the range that these core 3 are capable of. And for any of you who think that Dave Grohl has gone soft and lost his touch, this really puts the last few Foo Fighters, easy for me to say, albums into perspective very quickly. That is to say, it shows just how tame those records are, and this is really Dave Grohl letting loose and ripping it up, and he's still got it. That's not to say there aren't moments here for people who want something a bit more accessible, slightly more mainstream. Tracks like Barrio and Ego Bomb and a few others fill that area. And yes, Jello Biafra performs a John Cleese poem on the record. It's a quick hit of madness that's going to have fanboys going nuts. To me, it wasn't one of the best moments, but it wasn't one of the worst either. It's an interesting moment. I also really like the song The Deadhead. I liked it a lot, in fact, but unfortunately, it's right after that song where the record falls apart, and it kind of falls apart quickly. There's no way around it. This album becomes repetitive very fast. It's basically the same sound and approach on every song, but different singers. I guess you could say it becomes rock and roll karaoke with a bunch of songs you don't know. On so many of these songs, there's really nothing to differentiate from the others, and yeah, it gets old. It gets a bit monotonous at times because we've heard this before. It's just somebody else singing. And the other issue is that overall the mix on the second half of the album, it's terrible. The vocals are way too far in front on almost every song, and because of that, you lose a lot of the great riffs and rhythm work going on. What I think happened here is that these guys got a ton of awesome people to come in and lay down different tracks, and they made really, really cool songs. But the problem was, because they had all of these big names coming in, they were kind of obligated to release all of them regardless of the quality, because it's not like you can say, oh, sorry, Lee Ving, and his song's pretty good, but sorry, Lee Ving, we're not putting yours on because it wasn't one of the 12 best. They kind of painted themselves into a corner, so there's a lot of mediocre stuff here, and the record really suffers because of that. The great stuff is somewhat forgotten by the time you get to the end of the record, because it's got boring. It's got monotonous. Like I said, there's no way around that. But there's no question that the first 7 to 10 songs, that's where the goods on this really are, and they're really good. Beyond that, I'm going to say travel with caution. I guess another way of saying this is there's a really killer hard rock metal record living in this album. Sadly, it's not the record that these guys decided to release. So with that out of the way, I was digging through a bunch of emails that I've been sent in the last few weeks asking me tons of great questions about music, and one of them really set my mind off on a tangent. Today, I want to talk about the huge pitfalls and disadvantages that I see with streaming music services, because I actually think they do a ton more harm than they do good for music and the enjoyment of music, and it has absolutely nothing to do with bitrate or sonic quality. This is not the Neil Young argument, I promise you. Let me start off, though, with an extremely condensed history of music listening, just so we're all kind of working from the same page. Many moons ago, cavemen and women banged on tree trunks with slightly smaller tree trunks. Thus was born the rhythm section. But really, just under a century ago, you'd have the entire family gathered around a single radio listening to entertainment. That was really the at-home entertainment system at the time. Now, radio slowly became more music and less talk entertainment, and maybe for those who are a bit better off, you might have a player piano or a Victrola. But music in those days was very much a communal experience. Headphones weren't really a thing found in homes, and there was a good chance, a really good chance, that there was only one single radio in the entire home. Think about that. Let's just take an average family of 4. One radio. And you know what? That radio didn't broadcast around the clock, and you couldn't go up to it and tune to a channel and hear whatever you wanted when you wanted. It was, hey, this is what's playing on like the 3 channels at the time. And that slowly evolved, obviously, but for a long time it was, is there something on the radio? No, it's dead air. And one thing. So basically, everybody had to agree to listen to the one thing, or probably the parent said, this is what we're listening to. Now, soon enough, of course, record players became more ubiquitous, and, 78s turned into the standard LP and things like that. But you really don't see the first massive change in listening habits until actually the late 1950s. This is where music finally becomes very personal. It becomes a singular thing, because 45s are available at teens who have like after-school jobs, can afford them. And you also get those portable record players that you see in all those cheesy 60s films, the ones where they're carrying them like a box for parties. Yeah, those start to hit the market. But beyond that, you also get the introduction of the transistor radio. And I know a lot of you are wondering what was a big deal with that. Well, this is the point where the youth of the time could have a single earbud in their ears, and they could listen to the radio into the wee hours of the morning. The kid under the covers, with the flashlight on, listening to like a ball game or listening to some, pirate radio station. See, until that point, still, you had to listen to whatever your parents were playing. Or if there was a record player, you had to listen to things that they wouldn't mind. Or maybe when they weren't around. It really, again, was not something you could do in your own privacy until you get the transistor radio. By the 1970s, records are very much the medium of choice, and then you get the 8-track changing the game. A lot of people like to make fun of the 8-track, but suddenly with the 8-track, you can choose the music that is playing in your car, albeit with a fade-out in the middle. But it doesn't have to be a radio station and whatever the jock is deciding to play. You can have your Doobie Brothers 8-track, and you can listen to it all the time if you want. That is a huge milestone in personal music listening. This is, of course, one-upped by the introduction of the cassette Walkman in 1979, and that's when listening to music became an almost completely private experience. I mean, you could have your own tapes that you bought in your own Walkman, and no one would ever know what you were listening to or hear it unless you wanted to admit to them that you actually listened to Bon Jovi. But this is also where sharing music was in many ways beginning a new phase. Making mixtapes was huge for 20 some years. You could pass along an assortment of your favorite songs to a friend and they could enjoy it wherever they wanted. They didn't necessarily have to go buy it. So you have this massive change in the structure of how people are experiencing music. Now, this was pretty much the same with CDs when you could start burning CDs, and nostalgia freaks will tell you it's just not the same without decorating the tape box. Whatever. The idea is still the same. And after that, we eventually get to the iPod and the digital revolution, and that's kind of where we are today. Over the past few years, statistics show that digital downloads and streaming music are outright destroying the sales of physical media, and unless you're Prince, you believe that that trend is here to stay for a while. So yeah, that's about as much of a crash course as I can do. I mean, that's kind of that's the Cliff Notes of the Cliff's Notes. That's how brief we're going to go there, but that's the framework we want to work from today. Now, there are a ton of music streaming services out there. We know that. For the sake of this conversation, though, I'm going to use that term referencing Spotify, Pandora, and the iTunes Store, and everything else that is extremely familiar. I know there are a number of niche platforms out there that serve a very limited audience, but we're going to speak to the majority here, the place where hundreds of millions of people experience music the most. That being said, let's start with the age-old idea that too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. Now, I have absolutely nothing against the fact that thanks to streaming services, you can have instant access to pretty much any music you could possibly want. Whether you're looking to check out some pioneering Australian punk like The Scientists or The Fun Things, if you want to get into Tuvian throat singing from a group like Headhunterz, or even if you just want to blast Taylor Swift's 1989 album because it's a good record, shut up, it's catchy as hell, you can do that with just a few clicks, minus the ladder on Spotify for those of you who want to nitpick me. I know, but really. I love the fact that I can suggest a well-known or even a somewhat unheard of artist to people, and they can go find it pretty easily. A couple clicks, and boom, you're listening to whomever. You know, you're checking out Wesley Willis or something like that. Back in the days before the internet, the dark ages, we had to go to a record shop and dig through random crates, and they might not have what we were looking for. If that failed, you'd end up having to go through the lengthy and often expensive process of importing albums. And now, like I said, a few clicks and boom, you're there. You're checking out Tenariwen, or you're checking out 70s Nigerian funk or something. You know, it's amazing. But the problem is, with all of this music available without any real guides or context, people either end up getting lost in the weeds of the different services in their navigation, or they're completely intimidated by just the sheer number of bands out there, or in most cases, people will get stuck in a specific sound and never really get out of that space, and they won't even realize that's what's happening. I know some services offer recommended or curated content. Don't worry, we're going to get to that mess in a bit. But the thing you can't get away from is the solitude of the listening experience. Streaming services have basically destroyed the last gasps of enjoying music with friends. Remember, when you're listening to music on these services, most of the time it's on your computer or your phone. It's a very solitary thing. There's no human interaction or secondary source for opinion or anything like that. I mean, if you get to a track that's really rocking, there's nobody to give like a hell yeah to. I mean, you can do that to a stranger on the subway, but they won't be enjoying that tasty guitar riff along with you. Now, will they? It'll just be kind of awkward. This is where you get one of the most important and biggest differences between streaming music services and going to the record store or just listening to music with friends. When you're in a record store, suggestions of quality music they're all around you, and it's not linked in any way to what you're listening to at that moment, maybe even what you're looking for, or what someone else thinks you might enjoy based on that, or their special list of songs. Most record stores have albums all over the walls, along with in the bins you're digging through to find what you want. They have them on end caps. It's a music store. There's music everywhere. And in that process, you might see a really cool album cover, and it's going to lead you to, check out Herbie Hancock's Headhunterz, or maybe Kikugaku Moyo's Forest of Lost Children, or the Far Side's Bizarre Ride to the Far Side album. Cover art can do that. It can completely sell you on a record, and you don't even know the band. I mean, maybe you were going into the store to get a Fugazi reissue, but walked out with 5 different genres worth of music solely based on their covers. Really, it happens more often than you'd think. And that sort of random discovery just can't exist within the digital space. It's not set up to do that. Along with that, if you're just hanging out with friends and listening to records, the exact same thing can happen when you're digging through their albums or they put something on. And I say it all the time. The best thing you can do in life is share the music that you love with others. But I know, streaming services give you recommended listening. Recommended listening, folks, is a total smoke and mirrors act. Really. It is. See, this is where you're going to end up digging yourself into a very deep hole, but that hole never gets any wider. All of those recommendations are based on your listening history. So if, for example, you start by listening to some slightly more aggressive folk music, that's what it's going to recommend you. And that song is going to recommend off of the same thing and the same thing. No diversity, no random chance that it'll say, hey, you might like this record by Big Youth, or hey, this Jim Croce record is right up your alley because of what you've been listening to. Machines just can't think like that yet. Skynet is incapable of operating that well in 2015, thankfully. The machines can only really give you those recommendations from what you're listening to and the content connections they've been fed by the programmers. It's a very closed circuit and not a very rich experience at all. It's sort of like top 40 or classic rock radio formats. You know what you're going to get, and it's not going to deviate much from that path. Conversely, in record stores, you have people who know way too much about music, and the good ones among them are always willing to suggest stuff you've never heard. You can go in and say, hey, I'm really into The Fall, Slayer, the Notorious B.I.G., and Tori Amos. And they'll be like, oh, yeah, you should check out whatever. I off the top of my head, cannot think of something that would fit in that spot. But trust me, there's a record store guy out there somewhere who knows the exact group that person would love. And then, of course, there's also whatever happens to be playing in the store at the time when you're there. I cannot count how many albums I've bought over the years simply because it was playing when I was looking at records. Really, the Cinematic Orchestra, one of my favorite groups out there. I was in Finders Records in Bowling Green, Ohio, probably like 15 years ago almost, and they were playing their Everyday album, and I fell in love with it when I heard it. I'd never heard of the group, and boom, bought the album. I have their entire catalog. Many times that has happened to me. Really, it is a very cool experience and something you can really only get at record stores. And again, though, your friends play a huge part. They know what you're into, and they're hopefully into music, and maybe they stumble across some killer track or album they know you'd be into, and boom, sharing music the right way. You're not going to get that in the digital space. Or if you do, it's not going to have the same emotion behind it. Streaming services just can't recommend like that. They can't. It's a static thing versus a dynamic experience, really. Now, don't think I'm going to leave those oh-so-cool celebrity and mood playlists out of the argument, because people try and pass these off as being equal to mixtapes. And I'm sorry, they're just not at all. Mixtapes are a far more personal experience between two people. Playlists are a very cold interaction between someone and really nobody. I mean, you put songs in an order and whatever. Maybe someone will dig it, maybe not. It's a totally different breed of thing. And again, especially with the mood playlists, for the most part, they're completely predictable. Just like radio, it's the same 20 or so artists, and there's rarely anything radically different. I mean, even if you're looking for something like, I just want mellow mood sort of mixes or whatever, that can come from so many different places. That could be acoustic guitar, that can be down-tempo electronica, that can be new age, jazz, classical. Let's be honest, there are some metal songs that are very, very mellow. I mean, those mood playlists, though, when you look at them, it's like Ed Sheeran and an acoustic version of Let It Go. And they're like, oh, now you're chilled out. And it just doesn't, it's not the same at all. But perhaps my biggest gripe with streaming services, and I have many, is just how much it has people tethered to their phones and computers. Cassettes and CDs play anywhere. You can hand them to a friend and they work perfectly in their players. They don't need to have a specific app or a 4G connection or $9.99 a month. You can just give it to them and they can play it wherever, whenever. I'm not saying it's become an elitist thing, but there are massive dividing lines now, and it really disturbs me just how much of the social element of enjoying music has been lost and in many ways nearly forgotten. I mean, there's nothing like finding yourself ripping a wicked air guitar solo while Van Halen is blasting, and then you look to your right and you see your buddy rocking out just as hard. This is what makes music so amazing. Experiencing it, enjoying it, and sharing it with other people. Granted, I don't really want to share Beck's Sea Change record with anyone in the moment that I really need it, but when I know someone who's going through certain things in life, I can pass that to them and help them. You guys know what I mean. It's a very common experience, and it just doesn't work right with streaming services. There's something so impersonal about it when you really stop to think about it. Streaming services they can't replicate those moments, those interactions, and they really prevent people from the most important places to discover new music: record stores and friends. Now, I'm going to dig deeper in this in weeks to come, as I've got some guests coming in to speak directly to these ideas. But in the meantime, hit me up on email at getearfuel@gmail.com or tweet it to me at getearfuel, and let me know what you do to try and keep the social aspects of music alive in 2015. All right, so now it's time for your weekly Earfuel homework assignment. For those of you new to the podcast, each week I'm going to give you an album to check out in full from beginning to end. The idea is that music is rarely the focus of what you're doing these days. It's background at work, when you're driving, when you're cooking, whatever. And this is about taking some time each week to do nothing but enjoy music. Turn off your phone, your computer, whatever, and just appreciate the sounds. This week, since I mentioned it as one of my favorite album covers ever, your Earfuel is Herbie Hancock's Headhunterz record. With only 4 tracks running just shy of 42 minutes, this is in many ways the pinnacle of the acid jazz sound. And if you don't listen to jazz, it's okay. Don't let that intimidate you at all. This is a very accessible record. The grooves and the tones, anyone can get into these, and I guarantee within the first 30 seconds, you will be bobbing along to the sounds. Guarantee it. The group manages to put together this jaw-droppingly great musical achievement without any guitars, which for a funk-based, soulful jazz record is an achievement unto itself. And it's a total group effort here. Definitely one of those instances where the sum is much greater than the total of the parts involved. This one was recorded back in 1973, and Herbie Hancock is still making outstanding jazz to this day. If you dig this record, if you dig it when you listen to it, and I know you will, check out the self-titled albums from Return to Forever or The Meters, because you will absolutely enjoy those as well. I've got some fantastic guests coming in the weeks to come, really, so make sure you subscribe over on iTunes, follow me on Twitter at GetEarfuel, and that is your weekly Earfuel. Share and enjoy.